Hey ladies and gentlemen, Mr. E here. One of the big factors that drove the expansion of industry right around the turn of the 20th century were immigrants coming to the United States. Did you ever stop to think about why so many people wanted to come right around that time period? Well, stick around because that's what we're going to talk about today in Mr. E's classroom. Today's segment is all about the new immigrants. We've got a three-part question we're going to look at today. Why did immigrants come to the U.S.? What challenges did they face? And how did they help shape America once they got here? To really understand this group called the new immigrants, we really also need to know who the old immigrants were. Old immigrants were immigrants that showed up to the United States prior to about 1870. They mostly came from Northern and Western Europe. Think countries like Great Britain, France, kind of that area. When they showed up, they usually showed up skilled or educated, and they typically settled on farms. Remember, prior to 1870, that's how people in America made their money, was through agriculture. These people also really did a good job at adapting to what we are going to call the American culture. Mostly because the American culture was still in the process of being formed. Now that you know what an old immigrant was, let's talk about new immigrants. Who are the new immigrants? They typically arrived after 1870, from about 1870 to about 1920 or so. Mostly came from Eastern and Southern Europe, although there were also some Asian immigrants that showed up, as well as some Latin American immigrants that showed up. They typically were unskilled and uneducated when they got here. Most of them settled in cities. And for the most part, these immigrants faced a lot of prejudices, either from where they were coming from or once they got here to the United States, be it religious prejudices or racial prejudices. So exactly how many new immigrants showed up and where exactly did they come from? I've got this great map right here I want you to take a look at. Remember the three main groups of new immigrants: Europeans, Asians, and Latin Americans. Between about 1870 and 1920, roughly around 20 million Europeans showed up. Between about 1850 and the late 1880s, roughly about 300,000 Asian immigrants showed up. And between about 1880 and 1920, roughly around 250,000 Latinos showed up. Why would so many people want to come to the United States right around the turn of the 20th century? It boils down to two things called a push factor or a pull factor. So what exactly is a push factor? A push factor is some sort of condition that happens that forces people to leave their homeland. It could be things like war, could be lack of jobs, maybe an economic problem, maybe some sort of religious prejudices, but push factors force people to leave their homeland. A lot of people around the turn of the 20th century were being pushed out of wherever it is they came from. The other major factor is a pull factor. Pull factors are conditions that draw people or encourage people to want to move to a given area. In our case, the pull factors that pulled people here to the United States included things like religious and racial or political freedoms, things they didn't have back in their homeland. Land was another huge pull factor. Remember that Homestead Act? You show up and you can get all that land out west. Jobs were another major pull factor to bring people to the United States. Another big pull factor was also family and friends that had already come to the United States. Were very encouraging of people back at the homeland to say, hey, look how great we have it in America, you should come join us. How did most of these new immigrants actually get to the United States? Well, for most, it took just about everything they had to be able to buy a ticket to travel to the United States. Typically, these new immigrants would get on a ship with maybe one extra change of clothes, maybe a few family photos and trinkets in their pockets, and if they were really lucky, they would have some tools with them for a profession they were skilled in. Most traveled in what was called Steerage Class. Steerage Class was basically the cargo hold of a steamship. It was often incredibly crowded, usually pretty dirty, wasn't a whole lot of ventilation, and this is a trip that would generally take between about 1 and 3 weeks. Here's a great example of Steerage Class. Now think about the mindset of people if this is the way they chose to get to the United States. Things must have been pretty bad back home, or they thought things would definitely be worth this trip once they got to America. You just spent a few weeks on a ship in Steerage Class, you finally get sight of land of America. What happens next? Well, most Europeans arrived at a place called Ellis Island. Ellis Island sat in New York Harbor, and it was the place that you became a U.S. citizen. Back then, basically you showed up, you answered a few questions, you stepped across a white line, and boom, you were an American citizen. Most people coming from Europe had to go to Ellis Island, and that's where all this happened. Once you got to Ellis Island, an immigration official basically had the last word to determine whether or not you got to stay. If you showed up with some money or skills, you're probably pretty good to go. Most people had to submit to some sort of medical inspection once they got to Ellis Island, and about 20% of people that showed up got detained for a couple of days just to make sure they were healthy. Only about 2% of the people that showed up to Ellis Island were denied entry into the United States. If you were an Asian immigrant and you showed up to the United States, you would come through a place called Angel Island. It was in San Francisco Bay. Angel Island is probably the most misleading name of any immigration place ever. Immigration officials at Angel Island were incredibly difficult to deal with. They would often subject people showing up to incredibly harsh questioning, and most people that showed up got detained on Angel Island for long periods of time, weeks, possibly even months, in some pretty cramped conditions, kind of like this right here. It just wasn't a nice place. So you've immigrated to the United States. If you were a European, you came through Ellis Island. If you're an Asian, you came through Angel Island. You finally made it through. You've become a U.S. citizen. Now what? Immigrants typically sought out their own kind once they got here. They would look for communities that had people from the same places they came from. We call these ethnic communities. A lot of times these ethnic communities would retain the culture and the language of wherever the homeland was. This made for a much easier transition to the American culture. Immigrants in these ethnic communities became known as hyphenated Americans. Think like the Italian Americans or the Chinese Americans. A couple great examples of these ethnic communities would be places like Little Italy in New York City or Chinatown in Los Angeles. If you didn't know any better and you were walking through these streets, you would basically think you were back home in your homeland of Italy or China. With all these immigrants flooding into the United States, there's a little bit of a pushback. It becomes known as Nativism. Nativism was this belief that white native-born Americans were superior to the immigrants. All these immigrants basically caused way too much competition for jobs. And the nativists believed that they deserved those jobs before an immigrant did. This pushback of nativism grew so strong that at one point the government passed laws to prevent certain groups of people from immigrating to the United States. A great example of this nativism pushback is the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. It basically prohibited the immigration of any more Chinese from coming to the United States. It limited the rights of the Chinese that had already immigrated to the United States, and it basically forbade any Chinese that did come from becoming U.S. citizens. The great irony of nativism is this right here. Every white American that was here, every nativist, had some sort of immigrant roots. Eventually, the nativists started to push for what are called Americanization Programs. These were programs designed to assimilate immigrants into this new emerging American culture. Immigrants basically had to learn English, they had to start dressing American, and they had to start eating what are considered American foods. Even through these Americanization programs, a lot of the immigrants that were flooding into the United States still managed to retain a lot of their traditions and cultures. And eventually those traditions and cultures became part of the overall American culture. Alright, so real quick, some takeaways from this lecture. Remember that it's push and pull factors that bring immigrants here to the United States. Another big takeaway is that the trip to get here to the United States sure as heck wasn't easy, but most immigrants thought that it would be worth it. The last big takeaway is that even though immigrants tried to hang on to their customs and cultures through things like ethnic communities, the nativists pushed to Americanize those immigrants. And there you go, ladies and gentlemen. That's what you need to know about these new immigrants. As always, hopefully you got some good notes, and be ready because there's probably going to be a little quiz when you get to class. And lastly, as always, ladies and gentlemen, don't ever stop learning.